Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we are going to talk about some Victorian nonfiction. So first, I just want to apologize that I haven't been able to upload the past few weeks. Things at work have been extraordinarily crazy, and that's actually going to continue through the end of the year. And so I'm not exactly sure how consistent I'm going to be with posting any videos for the next couple of months, but I will try my best. So this video here, I had hoped to film and post early in October to help give some ideas for Victober, which is a booktube celebration about Victorian literature and or nonfiction, and it's hosted by various people throughout booktube. And unfortunately, because of work, I was not able to participate in any of the reading challenges. Again, like I said, I had hoped that this would be posted in early October, but here we are. I decided to focus on nonfiction instead of fiction. And that's just because I've been in just a nonfiction mood. I have not been wanting to pick up a lot of Victorian fiction lately, even though I love it. I just haven't been in the mood. So I gathered, I think, 10-ish books that delve into Victorian people or society or things like that. And out of the books on this list, I've currently only read one of them, but all of them are really great selections, and I can't wait to get to them when I get to them. So the first selection I have here is Queen Victoria, Daughter, Wife, Mother, Widow by Lucy Worsley. I've actually seen the subtitle of this also called 24 Days That Changed Her Life, and I'm sure it's a UK versus US title change, and I think this is the UK subtitle. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I'm a huge fan of Lucy Worsley, and I really enjoyed her biography about Jane Austen, which she wrote through the lens of the places that Jane Austen lived. Here in this book, Worsley is examining Queen Victoria via 24 specific days in her life through the lens of the four roles that defined Queen Victoria's life: daughter, wife, mother, and then widow. Queen Victoria was a, dutiful daughter shaped by a very restrictive childhood. She was a passionate wife whose marriage to Prince Albert influenced her entire reign. And she was also a devoted yet meddlesome mother, doing the balancing act of family with the demands of the monarchy. And then finally, she was a widow who became the new image of the matriarch of an empire. So Worsley's writing is really great and accessible, and so I am looking forward to reading this. Next is How to Be a Victorian, a Dawn-to-Dusk Guide to Victorian Life by Ruth Goldman. And in this, we are blending history, social commentary, and personal experience, where Goodman gives us an immersive look at daily life in the 19th century, structured around an ordinary day. So Goodman explores everything from morning routines, clothing, food, hygiene, work, leisure, bedtime, and she gives us details about how people of different classes really lived. And Goodman herself put these practices to the test. Particularly remarkable about Goodman's lively work is that she draws on her own adventures living in recreated Victorian conditions, thus lending her book a unique immediacy. She drinks beer for breakfast and brushes her teeth with a mixture of cuttlefish and soot. She navigates the difficulties of an unpredictable crinoline skirt and shimmies in and out of several styles of corset. Goodman endures such tasks with the critical gaze of a skilled historian and the cheerful vigor of a true enthusiast. So that sounds like a lot of fun. Next is Unmentionable, The Victorian Lady's Guide to Sex, Marriage, and Manners by Therese O'Neill. And in here, we are mixing sharp humor with historical research, where O'Neill pulls back the lace curtains to tell us what women's lives really were like in the Victorian period, revealing a world that was less prim and proper than Reputation. Now, I don't think O'Neill goes into such detail as Ruth Goodman in How to Be a Victorian by actually, recreating Victorian conditions, but O'Neill does a lot of historical research. So this is very witty, it's irreverent. She covers courtship, fashion, hygiene, sex, childbirth, and the strict social rules of the time. And the theme of the book is, yes, we may love watching our favorite Victorian period dramas, but after reading this, we'll never romanticize living in that era again. This is the only book that I've read out of this list from this video, and I really enjoyed it. Though by the end, I was getting a little tired of the humor, and sometimes just straight up facts without the snark would have been a nice change of pace. But it was fun. Hilarious, horrifying, shocking, and revelatory. Unmentionable is for every little girl who pictured herself running through a field of wildflowers in a silk dress and Little House on the Prairie boots, only to discover she has nits in her hair, her clothes have never been washed, and she sleeps with her poop under her bed in a bowl. All hail Therese O'Neill for uncovering all of that dirty, dirty laundry. So this was actually very informative and very funny, and I do highly recommend it. And I am looking forward to comparing it to what Ruth Goodman does in How to Be a Victorian. Next is The Mysterious Case of the Victorian Female Detective by Sara Lodge. So the traditional image of the Victorian detective is male. Just think of Sherlock Holmes. But there were actually many female detectives that assisted the police and worked for private agencies at the time. And in this book, Lodge uncovers the forgotten world of 19th century women sleuths, both real and fictional. She blends literary history with cultural analysis and traces how female detectives appeared in early crime fiction and what they reveal about gender and authority in the Victorian era. These particular women changed social norms and paved the way for the women detectives that we know in crime stories today. So this is going to be very, very interesting. The Marriage Question, George Eliot's Double Life by Clare Carlisle. And this is a biography about George Eliot, born Marianne Evans. And George Eliot is the author of such great works as Middlemarch and The Mill on the Floss. And this biography explores how Eliot's unconventional relationship with George Henry Lewis shaped her personal life and her fiction. So George Eliot and Henry Lewis couldn't legally marry. He was already married and he wasn't able to divorce his wife, but they lived together for 24 years and considered each other husband and wife. Carlisle uses Eliot's novels, her letters, and experiences to show how Eliot grappled with love, mortality, independence, and the institution of marriage. Carlisle portrays Eliot both as a radical thinker and a deeply human figure, constantly negotiating the tension between social expectations and her own desire for truth in belonging, something that is very much portrayed, in my opinion, in Maggie Tulliver of The Mill on the Floss. And if you have ever read that, I have done a review of it on my channel. Very powerful book. I reread it this year and was deeply, deeply moved by it. And it definitely is probably the most autobiographical of George Eliot's books. So keeping on with George Eliot, this is George Eliot, a collection of critical essays edited by George R. Creeger. So this book here was published in 1970, and I picked it up in a used bookstore in Boston. I have absolutely no idea if this book is in print. And this is a collection of critical essays on George Eliot's work. And most of the essays in here were written in the 1950s and 60s, with also an essay thrown in by Henry James from the 1870s. We've got essays such as Daniel Deronda, A Conversation. That's the Henry James ones. Intelligence as Deception, The Mill on the Floss by George Levine. George Eliot's Religion of Humanity by Bernard J. Paris, and The Authority of the Past in George Eliot's Novels by Thomas Penny. So obviously these are, possibly outdated essays, but who knows? I am very intrigued on reading what people in the 50s and 60s thought about George Eliot. Next is The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell, published in 1857. This is the first and classic biography of Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte had died in 1855, and Gaskell was friends with Charlotte mainly during the last few years of Charlotte's life, and was asked by Charlotte's father to write the biography. So Gaskell relies on letters, personal memories, and family accounts, offering an intimate glimpse into the Bronte family. I'm not exactly sure how subjective Gaskell is in here, but it does still remain a significant source of subsequent writings about Charlotte and the Bronte family. So I am intrigued to check it out. And if you know Elizabeth Gaskell, she, in her own right, is a favorite novelist of mine. She's written North and South and Wives and Daughters. So I am looking to see how she handles nonfiction. Keeping with Charlotte Bronte, this is Selected Letters by Charlotte Bronte. And so this is a collection of 169 letters written by Bronte between 1832 and 1855. The bulk of the letters appear to be to her close friend Ellen Nussey. There's some to her publisher, and even a couple to Constantine Heger, her old teacher who she was supposedly in love with. There's one to her father, but apparently no letters to her sisters survive. They weren't often apart, so it's not surprising that there wouldn't be many, but Charlotte did actually travel at various times. However, no letters to Emily or Anne appear to survive. So in these letters, we'll read about life at Haworth Parsonage, her experiences at the Belgian school where she met Heger, the deaths of her sisters, and even the London literary scene. Frances Hodgson Burnett, The Unexpected Life of the Author of The Secret Garden by Gretchen Holbrook Gertzina. This is a biography about Frances Hodgson Burnett, so who is the author of such beloved children's classics as The Secret Garden, The Little Princess, and Little Lord Fauntleroy, as well as adult novels such as The Shuttle and The Makings of a Marchioness, both of which I have not read yet, but I do own copies of, so I do plan on getting to those eventually. So this book will trace Burnett's journey from difficult childhood in Manchester, England. I believe she was born the same year that Elizabeth Gaskell, who I just talked about, wrote Mary Barton. So Burnett knows intimately the difficult situations that were Manchester in the 1840s and 1850s. So we're following her difficult childhood in Manchester, England, followed by extreme poverty in Tennessee. Her mother picked up the family and moved them to Tennessee, thinking they were going to go to a better life. We're following her rise to writing fame, both in America and in her home country. Her complicated marriages, she was divorced, shocking, her flair for fashion and society, and how her personal sorrows shaped her stories. Burnett was a very prolific writer, more than 50 books and 13 plays. She was also instrumental in changing copyright laws in England when people were pirating her books to make into plays. She was not having it. Although she published most of her famous works in the 20th century, she was extremely prolific in the Victorian period from 1877 onwards, specifically with Little Lord Fauntleroy, which was published in 1886 and skyrocketed her to fame on both sides of the Atlantic. So this is going to be a very good biography. It was the only good one I could find. I read another one, which I will talk about in a future video. I'm preparing a video about Frances Hodgson Burnett. That was not good, so I have high hopes for this one. And last, we have The Madwoman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination by Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Gubar. And this was published originally in 1979 with a second edition in the year 2000. This is a work of feminist literary criticism, groundbreaking when it was published in 1979. Gubar and Gilbert argue that female writers of the 19th century were confined to making their female characters as either angel or madwoman, according to standards set by male writers at the time. Gilbert and Gubar focus on writers such as Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot. They explore how 19th century women navigated a male-dominated literary world by expressing anger, resistance, and creativity through subversive characters and themes in their literature. You may have already guessed that the title of this book harkens back to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, who I just talked about. In Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason, who was not the OG madwoman, but she was probably the OG madwoman confined to an attic. I'll have to check on that. She represents how women's suppressed anger, restricted creative expression, and experiences of confinement can be misconstrued as irrationality or madness. So this is going to be absolutely fascinating, although it is very, very thick. So that is all I have for you today. 10 nonfiction books about Victorian people, Victorian society, Victorian literature. Have you read any of these? Let me know. I would love to hear from you. And what have you read for Victober? Please let me know. Again, always love to hear from you, and I will try my best to post as much as I can through the end of the year, but please forgive me if I am unable to be regular. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.